Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti. Sono felice di
Good
salutare gli
afternoon,
amici che seguono
welcome.
Facebook, YouTube di Una
I'm
Montagna
really
di
glad
Libri,
to
gli
greet all
amici
my
di Cortina
friends
Digital
who follow us
Forum
on
con
Facebook
cui
and
ho
on
organizzato
YouTube at Una
questo
Montagna di
incontro di
Libri,
oggi.
and the friends of Cortina
Torneremo, come
Digital
diciamo
Forum with
sempre, a
whom
Una
we've
Montagna di
organizing
Libri
this meeting
presto,
today.
incontrarci in carne ed
We'll
ossa
soon be
nella
back
nostra
to
Cortina
meet in
d'Ampezzo.
the
Speriamo
flesh, hopefully
presto
here
di
in Cortina
ritornare con questo
d'Ampezzi
programma
with
di
Una
incontri
Montagna di
digitali
Libri. I'd like to
continuando
remind
su
you that our digital meeting program
unamontagnadilibri.it.
continues also on
Prima di cominciare, per gli stabilisti,
www.unamontagnadilibri.it. For starting, you saw the protagonist of this meeting of ours. I'm really glad to have with us and whom I'm about to introduce to you all. I'd like to thank our institutional partners of Una Montagna di Libri, the region of Veneto and the municipality of Cortina d'Ampezzo. Also thanks to Audi, our main sponsor, and Converso, who directs our meetings from Milan digitally. To start, I'd like to start with a French philosopher whom I personally love very much, called Alain Finkielkraut, who once said, "We can no longer choose our problems. They choose us one after the other. We accept to be chosen." And in a certain way, this is the meaning of our conversation today, to anticipate in the debate the changes and innovations that are already taking place around us, whether we like it or not, and try to understand them in order to be able to make choices tomorrow, or as Marco Pannella used to say, to know in order to resolve or deliberate. So this is maybe also a duty, a responsibility we have. So let me welcome Mr. Stefano Quintarelli, entrepreneur, communications and IT expert. Thanks for having accepted this invitation. He's also been a member of parliament, but also a pioneer of the internet, and today the author of Artificial Intelligence, what it really is, how does it work, and what impact will it have. Published in Italy by Bollati Boringhieri, the leading publisher of scientific publications here in Italy. And then maybe here it is. You can see the book right now of Stefano Quintarelli. First of all, welcome Stefano Quintarelli to our conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I'm sorry I'm not there in person in Cortina, in fact. We will find a way to meet in person. It's a real pity we can't have our usual chats in Cortina d'Ampezzo with Una Montagna di Libri, but we'll do this very soon, I'm sure. So I'd like to remind you that the book is really precious. You did it with a contribution of various other scholars, Correa, Ferrauto, Fossa, Loreggia, Sapienza, to mention some. And this book really explores this immense and fascinating subject in a systematic manner, also with a knowledge on our side which is very limited. And so I'd like to say to you all that my questions will obviously those of somebody who doesn't know anything about AI, and happily so. I am an historian and I don't know artificial intelligence, if not, for those fascinating artistic and literary suggestions we see Mr. Quintarelli mentions in his book, and then maybe we'll mention some of them. But anyway, my knowledge of artificial intelligence is very limited, but we'll talk about this. I hope that for this reason, my curiosity is going to be useful to you all who are following us today and listening what Mr. Quintarelli has to tell us. Now, in order to get an overview of what artificial intelligence actually is, Mr. Quintarelli, I would like to go through history with you of this concept, a history that you, in fact, retrace in your book published by Bollati Boringhieri. What does it mean, as you rightly say, that we are living a sort of summer of artificial intelligence, as you call it in the book, which obviously follows winter, given that we keep to the Dolomites where, winter's cold and summer is nice. How did we come to the idea of artificial intelligence as we perceive it today, as you call it in the book, and where does it start from? Where did man start trying to create an intelligence which is not humane, but it's an emulation of the way in which our intelligence works, at least at the beginning? Can you give us an overview, an historical overview of this concept? Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say one thing. The preface in the book has been done by Piero Angela, whom I'd like to thank for his kind contribution. And it's the only name you didn't mention, and I wanted to mention it because with a group of co-authors, we have cooperated in writing some of the documents for different scientific papers and different associations. And so in the end, we decided to write a book. So it's a work that's been done by all of us. We all worked on the text context in a collaborative manner from remote. And it was fun also as a working experiment. The term artificial intelligence, well, man has always tried to create machines to help him work less or less hardly. And men hypothesized machine even when it didn't use to make them. And the same was true for robots. Robots were biological beings in a novel and in a Czech theatrical piece. Or again, in the Czech Republic, there seems to be something strange because many of these ideas stem from there. But anyway, in general, men always tried to develop machines to help him carry out the hardest jobs. And around 1955, some IT experts met during the summer at Dartmouth at the university, convinced that the reasoning mechanism of a human being could be mimed by a machine. And so they asked and obtained a grant, a fund for a summer grant to reproduce what they defined an artificial intelligence. And this is the way the term developed, a sort of marketing slogan to find the funds for this activity, for this research activity. It was $30,000, if I'm not mistaken. Now, instead, many billions of dollars went by together with a few decades, and we're still very far from reaching human intelligence because we will never be able to replicate human intelligence. But that was a very efficient slogan, a very efficient metaphor. We are at una montagna di libri, a mountain of books. Metaphors have meanings, obviously. We need to understand, though, that they are metaphors and we need to understand them. We don't wonder whether a mountain of books is the ideal, place for, deer to reproduce, because we have a clear idea of what the metaphor is. And instead, when it comes to artificial intelligence, the metaphor is not totally clear. So we hope with this book to clarify things a little bit. These are machines that carry out tasks that typically were associated with some sort of human intelligence, and so we call it artificial intelligence. And in fact, also, calculators that does the square root, a task that was characteristic of human intelligence, also include a certain level of artificial intelligence, very rudimentary one. Now, the one we have is more sophisticated and allows us to manage and tackle and solve more complicated problems than that of calculating the square root of a number. But still, these are calculations, full stop. Sure, thank you very much. And also thanks for homaging the deer here in Cortina d'Ampezzo. We are so nostalgic and we all want to go back to our mountains, the Dolomites. Stefano Quintarelli, I appreciate your sense of humor from a scientist and an expert. But wanting to provide a scientific definition to artificial intelligence, what is it, apart from the various anecdotes you talked about? Amongst the many, there's one, for instance, when you say the artificial intelligence of YouTube better recognizes which video contain cats, for example, or kittens. Well, if we would narrow down the conception of artificial intelligence to this, then your book would be limited. But there is something else, of course, and it goes not just through your machine learning mechanism, I would like you to expand upon, but also to a more adequate definition of artificial intelligence today. Sure, absolutely, yes. Well, let's say that from 1950 onward to today, various seasons have gone by, and this goes back to the previous question I did not complete my answer for. I mean, there have been very many seasons of euphoria and disillusionment. In the moments of euphoria, we talk about summers, and the moments of disillusionment when it comes to technology are called cold winters. And here there is always a cycle of ups and downs, as the peaks of mountains. So you have summers and then the troughs, i.e. the winters, the disillusionment. And now we are in a moment of summer for artificial intelligence, when thanks to a new approach, well, in fact, not a new approach, an old approach with new practice, because it was available only in theory now. Whilst now it is available in practice, we can now approach these tasks that were characteristic of human intelligence with new techniques and with machine learning in particular. Machine learning, again, is interesting because it's part of the family of metaphors. Machine learning, learning by machines. That means using computers to analyze data. So we can also call it an artificial intelligence based on data. So we can use machines to analyze data, and from data then select statistical models we can then use to make predictions. Obviously, everything sounds very complicated, but with an example, everything becomes much, much easier. Just as an example, if we see a nice sunset tonight, we can say that tomorrow the weather is going to be nice, because there is a proverb that tells us so. But this is based on the observation of reality. You look at reality, you see that yesterday it was nice weather, and so today it's nice, or yesterday it was right and today it's nice, and you repeat it again. Or yesterday, the sunset was not red, and so today the weather is bad. And on the basis of this observation of reality, of this data referring to reality, we create a statistical model, which is the proverb. When the sunset is red, the following day will be nice. This is statistical data. It's not certain. It's not like 2 + 2 is 4. Statistically speaking, if the sunset is red, the following day will be a nice day. Once we have this statistical model of reality, and this is the learning phase, therefore, extracting this statistical model from the observation of reality. Once we have this statistical model, we can use it to make new predictions. Say tonight the sky is not going to be red, then tomorrow I can go and play soccer. Maybe not, because probably tomorrow the weather will not be very good. So this is the essence of artificial intelligence based on data, machine learning. Observe reality, select statistical models out of it, use the statistical models to make new predictions, to decide whether we're going to play soccer tomorrow or not, or whether we're going for a walk in the mountains or not. Clearly, the observation in this case is very simple. I look west in the evening and I see whether the sunset is red, if the sky is red. But there can be much more complicated observations. I look at how many square meters and at which floor a flat is, and I predict the price. I study the correlation with the price of that home, and so I can develop a system that predicts prices for flats. Or maybe I look at the features of the image of a cell and I correlate it to the fact that this cell is a tumor cell or not, and so I can develop a system which, starting from the model, can predict, or at least tell me that histological test shows a cancerous cell or not. But the mechanism is always the same. Observation of reality, construction of the model. So if the sunset is red, the weather will be good. So a model for prediction. It works the same for everything. Okay, yes, many of the modern computer techniques try to copy or mimic the functioning of certain biological forms. You tell this in the book, and amongst the most famous ones, there's one that goes back and mimics the functioning of neural networks, which are obviously a way in which our unknown brain works. The neural networks are one of the bricks of the functioning of our brains. I know that this is a rather specialized subject, but given what you just told us, what you've just explained to us, could you please also introduce this concept? How can, by explaining what they are, how can neural networks influence the projection of artificial intelligence in which it is developed, perceived, and implemented today?
Quello che in matematica si chiamano dei grafi.
Neural networks are graphy, and they're part of the metaphor. They're graphi. They're nothing but patterns, say, of connections amongst different values. And these connections, in turn, have values. Imagine a web. A graph is a web with numbers and connections on the nodes where these connections meet. So this is a graph. And there's a way, and this is a great discovery that happened during the second half of last century. There is a way to use these graphs, these networks, to extract statistical models. And this is called neural networks. Also, our neurons, our brain is made up of networks. So there is an analogy. Obviously, neural networks, biological neural networks are much more complex, and we don't really know their functioning yet, at least not in detail. Whilst this mathematical tool, which we know very well, and which evokes the system in which the brain works, is a very powerful mechanism to extract statistical models, give it observations of reality, the forms of the cell, the price of flats, or the sunset which is red, and so on and so forth, the characteristics of the flats or whatever. It's a very powerful way to provide this data and make predictions, i.e. statistical models that can be used for predictions. So basically, these neural networks are sums and multiplications that are being made, large tables, huge tables of numbers with billions and billions of numbers that are summed and multiplied, added and multiplied an infinite number or a huge number of times. We're talking about linear algebra here. And this is it, basically. Neural networks are just a big pile of linear algebra. Yes, a mountain of linear algebra. In the meantime, I get corrected by Alessandro Marzomagno. I got corrected, certainly not you, because knowing to resolve is something Einaudi said before Pannella. This is an important detail because people who follow us are more learned than I am, for sure. Professor Quintarelli, I just also wanted to ask you something that has to do with my job. In your book, also to be a bit lighter, in the book you refer to some experiments that have been made and are being made in China with its role that doesn't always respect human rights. Experiments concerning the possibility of selecting, again, using artificial intelligence, some specific skills people might have. For instance, in a while I might be jobless because, a reporter in one of our meetings could be selected amongst many through a study of what? Of brain waves, and not only that. Obviously, these are parameters that are not far from, red at night, nice weather the following day. So my question is, in selecting competencies, skills, tasks, and jobs, should we expect artificial intelligence to deal with this in the future? And if you agree, this could also introduce the larger topic of ethics, which is right at the core of your book. So where does artificial intelligence substitute humane selection mechanisms that are often based on values, be them right or wrong? Okay, now this is a central question, and we could spend a few hours discussing about this during this afternoon session. But let's start by saying that the square root is something that our calculator can calculate. Before calculators, human beings had to be intelligent and taught how to calculate a square root, because a machine could not do that. The square root was an activity that showed human intelligence. Then calculators started doing the same, and on the press at that time, these were called intelligent calculators, and there was a big debate about whether these things would have made us dumber or less intelligent, or whether these things would have eliminated jobs. So this debate started. Now it's clear to everybody that that activity is not characteristic of human intelligence, because machines can do that. Clearly, machines, when they do that much faster, and in some cases with more precision than we can, given that they take so little time. And they can do it on a huge quantity of data. So they can do a lot more than what we as human beings do. And that's the reason why we designed those machines, because we wanted to do things more accurately and faster, because otherwise we would have had to do that ourselves. This is an example, but another example could be Excel, the spreadsheet. Those of us who use Excel spreadsheets in business know that if you want to create a budget, you have a specific function, you use that one, and that automatically finds the balance between assets and liabilities, costs, etc. This is another activity which before Excel required weeks and weeks of work with different cycles. We've invented Excel, spreadsheets in general, and we've simplified life to everybody, and none of us would ever now think of creating a budget without Excel. And that's not because we consider ourselves less intelligent, simply because it is easier. Now, with these machine learning techniques, with these artificial intelligence based on data techniques, we distilled the statistical model from data we observe from reality. And once we have distilled these models, we use them to make new predictions. What kind of problems do these statistical models solve? Well, they solve problems different from calculating the square root or finding, the budget or following a certain recipe as traditional software programs. So they solve problems of classification. So if it's nice tonight, tomorrow it'll be either bad or good, or this is a cell, tumor, non-tumor, this is a flat, this is the price range or not the price range. Again, classification. There are obviously slight imprecisions in what I'm saying, but I want to make myself understood by everybody. So this is a set of, say, photographs of traffic, and the prediction is I'll turn right or left, or I'll accelerate, or I maybe stop. And so on and so off, and so on, so that we have autonomous driving. So we have classification. And given that it's a machine that perceives and classifies, that machine works much, much faster than we could. And it does so on a much bigger quantity of data, hugely bigger than what a human being could manage. So let's give an example now. Suppose I want to analyze all people working in a very, very large company, and I give their CVs, their assessments to a machine, to ask the machine to find a correlation between this data and the wage of these people. So I take 50,000 people, I put them into a machine, into a computer, I tell the machine sanctions, promotions, studies, etc., etc., and I get the wage out of the machine. At this point, I have created a system that can predict the right wage, in inverted commas, for a person within that organization. A new person is hired, and that new person is hired, goes through the same statistical model, and the statistical model will tell me, 45,000 euro a year. If I did so, what I would do would be to crystallize problems that already exist in that company, because data represent the company for what it is and not for what we would like it to be. And we know that women are underpaid, for example. Given that we take existing data where women, alas, this is a reality, are underpaid, if we use this statistical model, if we use this system to build a model that predicts wage for women, when a woman will be hired, then that woman will be underpaid if we follow the model. Why am I saying so? This was a long premise. It's complicated, but I think it's going to be useful also in the follow-up of this interview. Because in reality, what we do is to create a model starting from data we find in reality. And we never know exactly which are the characteristics being assessed to actually come to a certain specific conclusion. We can foresee a correlation amongst all these things and the right wage in inverted commas, but it might not be so. Given that we gave historic data, Lombroso and physiognomics, I mean, this was a pseudoscience, and there were people who were absolutely convinced that by studying the shape of the skull of people, you could actually determine whether that person would become a criminal or not. And I mean, people were sent to prison for this. I know that you're speaking, but you're muted. No, I was just saying that this is one of the big, takes of the 19th century. Yes, and in the 21st century, the situation is the same. We think that any correlation implies a causal connection. We look at reality and we think that there is a causal meaning to that, but it's not given for granted. So if we use these tools to tackle whatever topic, well, probably we'll make huge physiognomic mistakes as the one by Lombroso. I mean, if we use this on the basis of characteristics which we do not really know of different behaviors, and we say, this is the perfect moderator or the perfect speaker at a conference, then we would probably, hit the wall and make huge mistakes by doing so. What we can know, what we can do, is find correlations between the behaviors of different people and the fact that the public, the audience, appreciates that, because this is clear. There is a correlation. We don't really know which correlation it is, but we know that it exists. Maybe the machine will assess the posture, the voice, the type of smile. It would find all sorts of correlations, and it would find correlations one way or another. But then maybe the correlation is connected to the background of the room. And so, if the background of the room would have been different, then the audience would have been different as a consequence. So in the end, you say it's the background of the room. No, we don't know. And so we've got to be very cautious, because not always the correlations we find are the basis for a causal connection and can help us make correct predictions. And not always the data we observe in reality are the data we think they actually are. But in fact, they describe a reality which, alas, is different from our idea of reality, because women are underpaid, because black people are discriminated, etc., etc., etc. And so basically this technology is wonderful on the one hand and allows us to do lots and lots of things, but we shouldn't overestimate it. We shouldn't think it's going to be the panacea, because there are correlations that are not causal. We can't think this is going to be the panacea of all our issues. We need to carry out experiments, and we start from data, and so data must be collected carefully, because quite often this is not the case. I look at the color of the sky by looking from underground. This is an incorrect way of looking at the sky if you want to forecast the weather for the following day. So correlations which aren't causal connections, collection of imprecise data, and data that describe a reality which is different from the one we envisage.
Well, in a moment, I have to tell you something else concerning ethics in artificial intelligence, which has to do with our mantra, which is surveillance, which is a very important topic, but let's talk about it in a minute from now. But Mr. Quintarelli, you talked about a very important question that is replicating through artificial intelligence, social layering, prejudices, and sometimes also injustices, let's call them by their name, which we, with our policies, try to fight against day in and day out. Well, tell us something more about what is recently talking about the US. And so I found the same anecdote told in two different books. The big issue of the US urban engineering or architecture, which you take from an essay about Robert Moses, where in speaking about the designer, you were indeed saying that bridges in the US, I had prepared a few pictures, but I cannot show them. Bridges can be just too low for buses to go through that. One thinks that it's a mistake. This was an intentional form of segregation for poor people and non-white people in the US and not to reach certain neighborhoods in the city. So in other words, a bus could not go through that. Given that I have read both Francesco Costa and the excellent book by Quintarelli, there are a few examples here in Italy as well to section out all these neighborhoods. And it's all very good. But what is the relationship that this bears with artificial intelligence? Well, the answer is rather obvious. When we design systems and the use we make of data may be oriented, although it does not appear to be a discrimination. It can be oriented towards generating discrimination or consolidating it. Well, that's where our ethics comes into playing. Those who design systems, when you talk about ethics in AI, that's not about the machine, because the machine does not have an ethics. Machine doesn't know whether a cell is a tumor. Machine doesn't know what a tumor is. The machine doesn't even know that this is a cell or an image. What they do, a machine find correlations among piles of data with other data without actually having an idea about the meaning. They're not aware of the meaning, those machines. We attribute a meaning. We choose data. We plan algorithms working on those data. We select and gather and collect data to develop algorithms. We put them into the machine. We validate the predictions that are being made. For instance, it's sad to say, actually, but at the very borders of Europe, I don't know whether it's still the same today, but it was so not long ago, or until not long ago, people used AI machines which were in a position, according to the seller, to recognize whether a person was lying when they would tell you where they were coming from, to decide whether to accept them or to reject them. This is something that has to do with excess, as Cesare Lombroso, a scholar, used to say in the past. It's us deciding what kind of action we are performing, whether this is a discrimination or not. So whoever comes into contact with these systems, producing them, designing them, trading them, using them, etc. This is not a panacea, of course. These are extremely useful technologies, and we are going to find them anywhere. This is a new way of piling up a software package. This can be called statistical planning, allowing us to come to terms with new issues, for instance, to recognize puppy cat on YouTube, classify flats, acknowledge diseased cells, recycle waste, or carry out surgery on plants so that we may reduce the use of pesticides, etc. I mean, this is going to be so pervasive that it will be everywhere. This is a new software, extremely pervasive. We should not load it with excessive expectations versus things that we cannot as yet explain, such as, for instance, acknowledging the right of asylum to people, or the protection over a criminal act or whatever, or recognizing tweens, etc. Well, maybe that's easier. well, it's comforting to know that it's easier to find a partner than reject a migrant. This is a good news. But yesterday, commenting news by ANSA that the authority in Italy rejected the system for face recognition, you have commented common sense is prevailing. This has to do with safety, the protection of people's rights, and face recognition, which is already part of our lives. If you have a smartphone, you can just have access to that by looking at the camera. But this is something different, having to do the safety device. That's Italian, but that can be interesting for other police systems, such as those at the borders of Europe. Why is it that this is a good decision? And I'm talking about the authorities' decision.
Si chiama
Well,
intelligenza artificiale, come dicevo, è una programmazione
artificial
statistica. La
intelligence is
statistica
based
è
upon
storia che
statistical
conosciamo
planning.
da Totò,
Statistics is
prima
what
tu neanche
we're
prima abbiamo
familiar
parlato
with.
prima.
If I
La
eat two
statistica
chicken and you
è
don't, we
intrinsecamente
ate
ha
one
degli
chicken
errori,
each.
genera degli errori.
Statistics
I modelli
intrinsically
statistici
generates
generano degli errori,
mistakes. Statistic
mentre il
models
software, gli
generate
algoritmi più
mistakes,
tradizionali,
whilst
i
a
programmatori più
typical
tradizionali, ogni volta che fanno più 2 uguale
algorithm-based
4,
software, whenever
fa la
you
serie.
make
Qui
2
per
times 2 makes
riconoscere un
4,
gattino
this
che
is
limita
always
un
going to
video,
be
ogni
done.
tanto ci proviamo, ogni tanto no.
Recognizing a
Allora, se
puppy
noi
cat
usiamo
within a
degli
video
strumenti,
sometimes works and sometimes
sappiamo per
doesn't.
costruzione
So if we
che ogni
use
tanto sbaglia,
tools
no?
that we
Dobbiamo essere
know
molto
by
attenti
definition
ed
that
essere
every now
capaci
and
anche di
then makes
trovare gli
mistake, we've
errori.
got to be
Chiaramente non
very
li
careful
rileva
to try to
all'strumento gli
detect
errori, se no non
mistakes, of
sbaglierebbe
course. The
perché
instrument will
poi
not
quello
detect
che si
them,
dice
otherwise it wouldn't be
human in
wrong.
the loop, quindi
Humans
la macchina
must
produce delle cose
interact.
e
So
l'umano
what we
prende le
call
decisioni,
humans in the loop.
piuttosto che
So
human
the
on the
machine
loop,
decides something
la
and a
macchina fa
human
ancora
takes
delle
a
decisioni.
decision, or
Ma per
humans
le
on the loop.
elaborazioni
That is, the
l'uomo che
machine
controlla
processes
è la
something
guida.
and
Ora,
man
affidare
double
questi
checks that.
sistemi di riconoscimento facciale
So
dobbiamo sapere che
using
sono
these
molto
face
soggette a errori.
recognition systems
Se
means
noi chiediamo
knowing that
in Inghilterra
they're
questi strumenti
subject
sono
to making
sistemati, parlando di
mistakes.
casa nostra,
In
sono stati
England,
piazzati per riconoscere
these
potenziali
machines have been
criminali vicino
placed
a
to
Parlamento,
recognize
Westminster.
potential
È stato fatto
criminals
poi un
close to the
FOIA, una
Parliament
richiesta di
at
accesso agli atti,
Westminster. Then
per
a
sapere cosa
request
stavano
to have
mettendo
access to data after a
e
while was
sapere qual
being
era la precisione di questi
filed in
soggetti.
order
Se
to
noi chiediamo
know whether
all'identificazione di tutti
the
gli
precision
oggetti
was
che
good
sono
enough.
addetto ai
If you
lavori,
ask
se
a
quegli oggetti
policeman,
funzionano, ti
um,
dice sì, abbiamo arrestato
the
4 persone e
gadgets
quindi
work,
funzionano.
it says to
Ma
you,
non ci
yes,
possiamo limitare
because
a
we
questo.
have got
Noi ci
4
dovremmo
people, but
chiedere
we cannot
tutti
restrict
i
our
reati che sono
research to this.
passati lì
We
davanti,
should
quanti ne ha effettuati il
wonder,
sistema?
out of all criminals who
Questa è
went
una
through
domanda che
there,
non può avere
how
risposta,
many were
perché se noi
recognized by
sappiamo
the
che sono
system? This
passati
is a
100
question with
criminali e il
no
sistema ne ha
answer. Because
riconosciuti
if we
10,
know that
vuol dire
there
che non
were
se ne
100
sappiamo che
criminals
ce
and the
n'erano altri
system has
90. Se
recognized
sapevamo
only
che
10,
c'erano li
we
dovevamo
know that
arrestare,
there
quindi noi
were
non
another
sappiamo quanti
90,
sono i
but
criminali.
we should have
Questo è un dato che
arrested them had
strutturalmente ci
we
dobbiamo
known that they
portare.
were there, but we did not. So
In
this is a
statistica si
structural
chiama
piece of
recovery
information which
ed è
is
una delle
lacking,
misure
which
della correttezza
in
di questi sistemi.
statistics is
Di tutti i
called
criminali che sono
retrieval,
passati
and it's one
davanti,
of the
quanti li ho
measurements for these
beccati? Quello è il
systems.
recupero.
Out of all
E c'è un'altra
criminals, how
dimensione, che è la
many I
precisione.
have
Di tutti
caught?
quelli che ho
This
fermato,
is the
quanti
retrieval
erano
system.
veramente
And then
criminali?
another
Sono due
precision
domande
model.
simili ma
Out
due
of all the
diverse.
people
Il
who
sistema
were
italiano del
caught,
Regno
how
Unito,
many were
di tutte le
actual
persone
criminal?
fermate,
The
il
system is used
96% non
in the
erano
United
criminali.
Kingdom.
Quindi stiamo usando un
96% of
sistema
all the
che
people caught
uno
were
non
not
sappiamo
criminals. So we're using
quanti
a system
criminali
that,
riesce a
one,
beccare,
we do not
e
know
due
how many
sappiamo
criminals
che tutte le volte,
can
per tutte
catch.
le volte che
And we
fanno
know
qualcuno,
that
la quasi
whenever
totalità
someone
non è un
gets
criminale.
stopped,
Questi sono limiti
practically
intuitivi, anche
almost
se ci vuole
all of
della
them are
tecnologia,
not
non è che ci possiamo
criminals.
fare
These
niente.
are intrinsically
Questa
restrictions and
cosa
limitations by
elevata, visto che
technology,
come
and there's
dicevo
very
c'è una
little that we can do
calcolatrice fa
about
le
it.
radici quadrate
Well, as I said before,
infinitamente
a
più veloce delle
calculator
immagini, le macchine
calculates
fanno
square
esercizi di
roots
classificazione
definitely
infinitamente
more
più
quickly
velocemente
than
di
us.
noi.
These machines
In
classify
Italia,
definitely quicker than we
prima
can.
del sistema
In
SARI,
Italy, before the
c'era una
Sahari
c'erano
system, we used to have
le famose persone schedate, no? C'erano i
the
cartoletti dove c'erano
so-called
e che erano
people
50.000 persone
on
schedate sul
parole,
fronte. 50.000
etc. And there
vuol
were
dire che se poi
practically
arrivava qualcuno di
50,000
alto,
people on
unta
parole,
intorno ai
which
40
means
kg,
if
con
someone
occhi
would
grigi,
tell you
capelli
this
corti,
guy is
eccetera,
1.8
guardava quelle cose, tirava
meters
fuori: questi
high,
sono i 30
blue
sospettati, questa
eyes,
persona aveva
short
detto
hair,
questo, potrebbe
etc.,
essere
you would
questo, e quello era
take
quello.
all the files of the
Questa
suspects
percezione e
and you would choose
classificazione era
among them. This
intrinsecamente lenta,
perception and
e doveva
classification
fare un
was
umano,
intrinsically
perché
slow
erano foto
because it
cartacee.
had to be carried out by a
O magari
human
schede a un
being, because
computer, ma
these were
sempre
all
gestite
photographs or
esattamente
maybe
intrinsecamente
computer
così. Nel momento in cui
files, but always
digitalizziamo questo
managed by a
sistema
human.
e lo
So
facciamo fare con
intrinsically
un'intelligenza
slow. If
artificiale,
we
questi
digitize this
limiti
system and
fisici
this
di
is carried out
manipolazione
by
degli oggetti
artificial
non ci sono
intelligence,
più. Le cose
these physical
scadono, questi
limitations are no
infinitamente
longer
grandi di
there.
quantità
And
digitali.
things indeed
Ed ecco
may
quindi
be
che
increased
5.000
both
cartellini, 5.000
volume-wise and
cartellini sono
speed-wise.
diventati in prima
Well,
battuta
that's why
100.000,
50,000 files
poi sono
became
diventati 1.000.000 e
100,000 and
l'ultima
then 1
ipotesi,
million,
ecco, dei
and
numeri
then maybe I'm just
freddissimi,
quoting numbers which are not very
questi,
correct, but the order of
credo di non
magnitude
sbagliarmi, non
was
sono
this, and I
fisico
believe I'm not
100%,
wrong, but I'm not
diciamo sono
100%
sicuro ma
sure
neanche
about that.
100%.
Well, let's say that I'm sure only
L'ultima
to
interrogazione parlamentare che è stata fatta sul
95%.
tema
And
aveva
the
rivelato che in
last
Italia
parliamentary
il
inquiry
FIAT ha
on this theme
16
revealed
milioni di
that in
foto
Italy police
appartenenti a
has
9 milioni di
16 million
soggetti.
photos
Ed
belonging
ecco
to
che
9
il
million
cambiamento
people.
di
Now,
natura
you
da
see here that the
le
change
foto
of nature
fisiche a
from physical,
digitale
and
con
we're talking
l'intelligenza
about physical
artificiale
photographs,
cambia
to digital through
completamente
artificial
le dimensioni
intelligence,
del problema.
changes
Una
completely the
volta
size
chi si
of the
occupava di
problem.
diritti umani,
Once
di
upon a
diritti
time,
civili,
those
eccetera,
who
non si
dealt
metteva
with human
il
rights and
problema
civil
di
rights as well
evitare la
would
schedatura
not
diversa di 10 milioni di persone
wonder
e
about the
non
problem
soltanto
on
in
how
virtù
to avoid a mass
dei limiti
filing of 10
detto dai
million
limiti
people, because
fisici.
it was
Quando
just
questi limiti fisici
impossible.
non ci sono
There
più,
were
ecco che succede
physical
un'innovazione.
limitations
Allora
and
far
restrictions.
cambiare
When
da
these are
fisico
no
a
longer there, then
digitale
there
con
is another
l'intelligenza
question.
artificiale
Changing from
non è
physical into
un'operazione
digital
neutra,
through artificial
richiede una
intelligence is not a
riflessione sui
neutral
valori di fondo
endeavor.
della
It
democrazia
calls
del paese in
for
cui stiamo,
really
delle
truly
procedure di
pondering
garanzia
on
e via
the
dicendo.
basic values of
È
democracy, the
chiaro che
country
questo
where we
richiede
live,
anche
and
la cultura.
guarantees, etc.
Parlo
Well, clearly,
chiaramente
this also
sulla nostra
depends upon
europea, perché in
culture, and I'm
Cina hanno una
talking about
percezione
our own
diversa
European
degli
culture, because in
individui, dei
China
diritti,
they
eccetera,
have a
da noi come
different
sappiamo.
perception of the individual
Come Cina
rights,
piuttosto che altri
etc.
paesi
I'm talking about
genericamente.
China, but
Quindi
I may, quote
questa
other
decisione del
Far
Parlamento
Eastern
non fa
countries,
altro che
etc. So
riportare
this
l'ago della
decision by the
bilancia
public
e
authority
dicendo che questa cosa non va
brings
fatta
the balance
rispetto a una
back
riflessione
by
più
saying
profonda
that
che non
this
è
should not be
meramente
done,
il passaggio
versus a
tecnico da
more
un modo
profound
all'altro, perché il
thought,
passaggio
which is
tecnico
not
materiale
just
e
the
immateriale
technical switch
cambia
to one
radicalmente la
system to
natura
another,
del
but
trattamento.
the
Quindi che ha fatto il
passage
garante intervenire?
changes radically the very
E
nature
su questo c'è
of
qualche filtro
the object. And
purtroppo,
therefore, authority, the
naturalmente c'è
public
cosa.
authority, did the right thing
Io ero in
to do
Parlamento
that.
nella
And there is
legislatura scorsa e avevo
other
fatto una
anecdote, if
proposta
I
di
may. I
mozione
was
in
a member of
materia
the
di
parliament
armi autonome
during the
e
last
avevo, come
legislature,
dire,
and
preso
I
le armi, le metto
filed a
sotto
bill
competenza
on
dell'intelligenza
autonomous
artificiale
weapons,
e poi
which
le
means
mando a
I take a
girare sopra ad
weapon,
ammazzare questa gente.
attach some artificial
E,
intelligence, and then
ora,
send those weapons alone
chiaramente lì non
to
è che mi
kill
interessa
people. Well,
tanto
clearly,
la
what
precisione, perché
matters to
penso che
me
un
is
umano
not
che fa della
really the
guerra se ne ammazza
precision, the
20 o un meno
accuracy.
è
I
uno di
mean,
quelli
if I kill
che
one more or one
avrebbe
less during a
previsto
war, it
un
doesn't really
uccello,
make a big
un
difference, is
grandissimo,
it? It's not
come
a
dire,
big
una
deal.
grandissima, non è necessaria una grandissima attenzione.
So we don't
Però
need
diciamo che la
really to
tecnologia
be
oggi ci
very careful
consente
about
di
all this. But
costruire
technology allows us
dispositivi
today to
d'arma che
be
sono in
able
grado
to
autonomamente di fare
build
percezione e
some
classificazione,
devices which
quindi andare
independently
a
can perceive,
identificare,
classify,
selezionare
so
il bersaglio,
identify and
identificarlo,
select a
seguirlo,
target,
colpirlo,
identify it, follow
tutto in
it,
modo autonomo.
hit it
Chiaramente
completely
questa è una cosa
independently and
che
autonomously.
non è,
Now, clearly,
insomma,
this is
dobbiamo riflettere,
something
non
that
è come
needs to
prendere
be taken
un'arma
very
e metterci
carefully.
una molla un
It's
po'
not
più
just
forte e
like
sparare più
taking a
velocemente. È una
weapon
cosa un po'
and
diversa. Nei
adding
gruppi
a
legati alla nostra,
trinket and have
della Commissione
the
europea di cui ho
weapon
fatto parte,
firing
pur
more
come sta
quickly.
avendo l'Unione
Within the
Europea una
team in
competenza in
Brussels I was
materia di
part of,
difesa,
although the European Union
noi
is not
abbiamo ritenuto
competent
di
on
doverci
audience. We thought that we had to express ourselves and voice our being against the building of completely autonomous weapons, although this was not part of our mandate. We wanted to express an opinion on that. And when I was a member of the parliament, I made a point on this, and I filed for a resolution saying, well, let's try to restrict this particular development. Let's ask our partners to really think twice about this before implementing it. I'd expected people to agree on this with me. Indeed, my resolution did not pass, and the outcome was a kind of touched-up document. And then I asked a colleague of mine, do you trust your computer? He says, no, because all computers break down. And do you trust a computer whereby you can kill only evil people? And he said to me, well, computers belonging to the army don't make mistakes. So this speaks for itself. You need culture to understand the limitations, potentials of artificial intelligence, etc. And part of the resolution was to suggest that within international dealings, when it comes to weapons, we not only have or must have military experts, but also experts on artificial intelligence. Otherwise, we're running the risk of getting into a swamp which is not compatible with our constitution. Unfortunately, my draft resolution was rejected. It doesn't really surprise me because vis-à-vis the average background, cultural background of other members of parliament, this does not come as a surprise. We have another 8 minutes to go, but I have to ask you a question, but give me a concise answer. First of all, is really having to do with ethics and surveillance. I read The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, but another book by Lewis University Press and by David Lyon, The Culture of Surveillance, are interesting books. Given that we're talking about Alexa in your book, but also other voice assistants, talking about this data, do you think it's fair for multinational companies or any other company designing all this as an integration for all households, as Shoshana Zubo seemed to suggest it a few years back? That is, if you have a smart home system, the information of the smart home are within the same household and not being given to third parties. We know that Microsoft, Google, Apple make wide use of these data and have free access. According to Shoshana Azubov, all this was a intrusion and a damage to our privacy, and for some people also intrusive into our households. There is no Orwellian big brother, but we have to monitor all these systems. And in one way or another, we kind of overcome technology. And I wanted to understand what you think about it. Well, the question is very long. I shall try to give you a concise answer. I wrote another book on this previous on artificial intelligence. The title is Immaterial Capitalism. What Azubov said is correct, but it's only part of the game, so to say. And it's only a partial discussion on digital intermediaries, because Booking and Airbnb do not perform surveillance capitalism, but there is nonetheless the same pattern of behaviors. So there is a common root. And so just read also Immaterial Capitalism if you want to know more about it. Well, certainly, data have to be brought back within the framework of the sphere of control by all users. This is one of the conclusions that I draw in my book, immaterial capitalism. But I can go even further on. Montesquieu used to have a statement about that. He is a historian, and he thought about how to sort out power, which is the foundations of Western democracies. We have the three powers. But what about now, in the era of surveillance capitalism? How do we go about when it comes to those systems controlled by the government and therefore by a minister potentially? And these things can interfere, intrude into people's lives. The only difference is that this government has a monopoly of the strength vis-à-vis these subjects. And therefore, if we are to pay great deal of attention to surveillance immaterial capitalism, we at the same time will have to pay attention to IT used by the government. And we talk too little about it because the government, the state, has a monopoly on these terms. And you have choices to make between distributed and centralized systems. The Constitution set out some rules. But what about IT vis-à-vis all these situations? Because, of course, one has to get worried about surveillance capitalism, but we have to be also worried about surveillance executive power. And this has to be taken into consideration in good moments, because so that in bad moments can have those guarantees. And if we did not develop them when the time is good, we have to prevent this to happen when time is bad, and therefore avoiding setting up instruments to be used by a kind of a corrupted form of government. So this is a good moment to develop all these things. I remind you that you can get into an authoritarian system by voting. Prime Minister Draghi said it, and according to President Draghi, you may be elected and become a dictator. You get into an authoritarian system based on voting. It's very rare that you have a system whereby you get rid of an authoritarian system by voting. So we have to try to make our best efforts that capitalism and surveillance will be extended to a surveillance government. I invite you to read also the other book.
Yes, Stefano Quintarelli's Immaterial Capitalism, absolutely, and thank you for your answer, which I would like to remind you of together with Artificial Intelligence, today's book. And I'd like to show it one last time before asking one last question to Stefano Quintarelli. Can we see the cover of his book, which is again published by Bollati Boringhieri and which is sold also here in the Soville bookshop in Cortina, but you also find it everywhere in Italy. So we are at a Montagna di Libri, besides being at Cortina Digital Forum, so I cannot but ask you very quickly, we have 1 minute, amongst the various literary, cinema and works of art you read on artificial intelligence, which are all an approximation, of course, because they're not essays, which is the one you're closest to, or the one that gets closest to the reality of artificial intelligence that you would suggest? Well, it's exactly the opposite. The most interesting ones are those that really make you dream and that are really far from reality. Obviously, 2001 Space Odyssey, HAL 9000, HAL, which are the letters before IBM, and then the idea of optical memory. I mean, there are lots and lots of very interesting ideas in that movie, some of which, became reality, and others which, at that time were almost incredible and are still science fiction today. There are very many worries about artificial intelligence because we might create super intelligent, superhuman machines developing a conscience, etc., etc. But in the report we have written with the European Commission, with this group of experts, we wondered about this. Do we want to talk about these things or not? Because if we do, we are going to mobilize them. If we don't, it looks as though we're ignoring something. And and that maybe we want to hide something. So in the end, we decided to talk about them in a note which says that these are unrealistic worries. In fact, unrealistic, the term unrealistic or unrealistic has been decided on a Saturday because we thought about science fiction before. Science fiction is beautiful, it makes us dream, and it's correct for us to read it. Very many things then become realities, but the majority of them don't. And artificial intelligence is not what we see in Hollywood, but rather what I explain about in the book. Okay, thank you. Thank you wholeheartedly to Stefano Quintarelli, the author of Artificial Intelligence. We hope to see you in Cortina d'Ampezzo. Thank you very much.